think we should open with a great big applause for Leckie and thank her for coming here.
Thank you for having me. This has been so much fun.
And it's wonderful to have you here. First, a question. We're reading from Ancillary Mercy. Will this be a spoiler for anyone? No, we're safe.
Okay. Yeah.
What page?
The scene where translator Zayat arrives.
Okay.
In fact, when the book first came out, I would ask people, you know, the book's just come out, is this going to be a spoiler? Are you going to have problems? And everybody was like, no. I'm like, all right. And I will say, I know the audiobook, which the narrator, Ajwa Ando, is fabulous. She does a great job, but nobody asked me about the pronunciation of the names. And so very few of the names does she say the way that I think of them. And so, for instance, she says translator Dleek, and in my head I hear translator Dleeke. And but I've told people who ask me, they'll email and say, how do you pronounce this name? And I'll say, well, I do it this way, but Raj space is huge. There are so many dialects and accents that probably the way you say it is right somewhere, right? So it's not a big deal. Yeah. So this is where, of course, you all remember, those of you who have read it, that translator Dleeke met with a terrible fate. And people are worried about what the Presger might do if they turn up and discover that something has happened to their diplomatic representative. And one of these, another diplomatic representative has turned up, and so everyone's very worried about what's going to happen next. And Governor Jared and Breck, the main character, are standing there waiting for the hatch to open. The hatch clicked and thunked and swung open. Governor Jared stiffened, trying, I suppose, to stand straighter than she already was. The person who came stooping through the open hatchway looked entirely human, though of course that didn't mean she necessarily was. She was quite tall. There must have barely been room for her to stretch out in her tiny ship. To look at her, she might have been an ordinary Rajchai. Dark hair, long, tied simply behind her head. Brown skin, dark eyes, all quite unremarkable. She wore the white of the translator's office, white coat and gloves, white trousers, white boots. Spotless, crisp and unwrinkled, though in such a small space there could barely have been room for a change of clothes, let alone to dress so carefully, but not a single pin or any other kind of jewelry to break that shining white. She blinked twice as though adjusting to the light, and looked at me and at Governor Jared, and frowned just slightly. Governor Jared bowed and said, "Translator, welcome to Athwick Station. I'm System Governor Jared, and this," she gestured toward me, "is Fleet Captain Breck." The translator's barely perceptible frown cleared, and she bowed. "Governor, Fleet Captain, honored and pleased to make your acquaintance. I am Presger Translator Dleeke." The governor was very good at looking as though she were quite calm. She drew breath to speak, but said nothing, thinking, no doubt, of Translator Dleeke herself, whose corpse was even now in suspension in medical, whose death we were going to have to explain. That explanation was apparently going to be even more difficult than we had thought, but perhaps I could make at least that part of it a bit easier. When I had first met Translator Dleeke and asked her who she was, she had said, "I said just now I was Dleeke, but I might not be. I might be Zayat." "Begging your very great pardon, translator," I said, before Governor Jared could make a second attempt at speech, "but I believe that you're actually Presger Translator Zayat." The translator frowned, in earnest this time. No, I don't think so. They told me I was Dleeke, and they don't make mistakes, you know. When you think they have, it's just you looking at it wrong. That's what they say, anyway." She sighed. "They say all sorts of things. But you say I'm Zayat, not Dleeke. You wouldn't say that unless you had a reason to." She seemed just slightly doubtful of this. "I'm quite certain of it," I replied. "Well," she said, her frown intensifying for just a moment, and then clearing. "Well, if you're certain, are you certain?" "Quite certain, translator." "Let's start again, then." She shrugged her shoulders as though adjusting the set of her spotless, perfect coat, and then bowed again. "Governor, Fleet Captain,
honored to make your acquaintance. I am Presker Translator Zayat, and this is very awkward, but now I really do need to ask you what's happened to Translator Leckie. I looked at Governor Jared. She had frozen, for a moment not even breathing. Then she squared her broad shoulders and said, smoothly, as though she had not been on the very edge of panic just the moment before, Translator, we're so very sorry. We do owe you an explanation and a very profound apology. She went and got herself killed, didn't she? Said Translator Zayat. Let me guess. She got bored and went somewhere you'd told her not to go. More or less, Translator, I acknowledged. Translator Zayat gave an exasperated sigh. That would be just like her. I am so glad I'm not Leckie. Did you know she dismembered her sister once? She was bored, she said, and wanted to know what would happen. Well, what did she expect? And her sister's never been the same. Oh, said Governor Jared, likely all she could manage. Translator Leckie mentioned it, I said. Translator Zayat scoffed. She would. And then, after a brief pause, are you certain it was Leckie? Perhaps there's been some sort of mistake. Perhaps it was someone else who died. Your very great pardon, Translator, replied Governor Jared, but when she arrived, she introduced herself as Translator Leckie. Well, that's just the thing, Translator Zayat replied. Leckie is the sort of person who'll say anything that comes into her mind, particularly if she thinks it will be interesting or amusing. You really can't trust her to tell the truth. I waited for Governor Jared to reply, but she seemed paralyzed again, perhaps from trying to follow Translator Zayat's statement to its obvious conclusion. Translator, I said, are you suggesting that since Translator Leckie isn't entirely trustworthy, she might have lied to us about being Translator Leckie? Nothing more likely, replied Zayat. You can see why I'd much rather be Zayat than Leckie. I don't much like her sense of humor, and I certainly don't want to encourage her, but I'd much rather be Zayat than Leckie just now, so I suppose we can just let her have her little bit of fun this time. Is there anything, she gestured doubt, anything left? Of the body, I mean. We put the body in a suspension pod as quickly as we could, Translator, said Governor Jared, trying very hard not to look or sound aghast. And we didn't know what customs would be appropriate. We held a funeral. Translator Zayat tilted her head and looked very intently at the governor. That was very obliging of you, Governor. She said it as though she wasn't entirely sure it was obliging. The governor reached into her coat, pulled out a silver and opal pin, held it out to Translator Zayat. We had memorials made, of course. Translator Zayat took the pin, examined it, looked back up at Governor Jared, at me. I've never had one of these before, and look, it matches yours. We were both wearing the pins from Translator Leckie's funeral. You're not related to Leckie, are you? We stood in for the translator's family at the funeral, Governor Jared explained, for propriety's sake. Oh, propriety, as though that explained everything. Of course. Well, it's more than I would have done, I'll tell you. So, that's all cleared up then.
Thank you very much. I was actually going to ask this question later, but it feels like it fits very well now.
Okay.
Can you tell me some more about the translator and the Presker, or is that all secret?
I know more about the Presker and the translators than has appeared on the page, but I think it's probably better to keep them as mysterious as possible. I'm very afraid as a writer that if I put them directly on the page, all my readers will go, oh, is that all they are? They won't be mysterious anymore. So I figure I'm going to keep them off stage as much as possible and exploit their mysteriousness. Yeah.
The ancillaries in themselves and the rad ships are fairly mysterious, even though they are on page for all the 3 books. How did you come up with this idea, with this first present near omniscient narrator to tell us everything?
Actually, the ideas for the books began around the idea of characters with more than one body. Not just the ships, but also, of course, Ananda and I. But once I had that idea, I had to make it work somehow and turn that into a story. And that took a while. And then once I had a story, figuring out how to write from that point of view was really, really super difficult. And it took me a very long time. I actually spent several years writing other things because I didn't think I could write ancillary justice. And finally, I said, I'm going to have to do it, or I'm not ever going to do it. So I'm just going to have to hold my nose and jump. And so I did, and kind of just said, well, I'll just lay it out on the page as clearly as I can. And it seemed to work. But I'm not sure why the idea of characters with many bodies really appealed to me. I'm not sure really where that ultimately came from, but that is where it started.
We can have one audience question, maybe? Anyone who wants to ask something?
Sure.
Uh-huh.
So, how much were you thinking about Rome, and how much were you not thinking about Rome when you built Thrach?
I was thinking about Rome a lot. A lot.
Yeah.
Partly because when I do world building, whether it's for my fantasy or for science fiction, I do like to draw on the real world, and I like to feel like I've got a real underpinning. Very often I like to say, oh, well, I've got a folk tale or an old story, not that I'm using to base the story on, but that gives me a kind of an underpinning to make choices with. And so Rome was a real big source for giving me things like that I could use. But at the same time, I didn't want the Rajai to just be space Romans, you know. That's been done for obvious reasons. I mean, space Romans are kind of super awesome, right? But I didn't want them to just be transplanted. So anything that was shiny, I grabbed. But I did grab a lot from them. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
But there's not. I think one of the most interesting things is how it's clearly not just not space Romans,
Mm-hmm.
but also you have so many different cultures, and all of them feel wholly formed, as if there's actually a real culture behind. It's not Planet of the Hats. How has the reaction? I mean, the reaction to the books has been good, but how has the reactions been, and the
to that
process of
particular?
writing?
A lot of people have noticed that, which I've really appreciated. One of the things, I mean, I like old school pew-pew, space opera, pulp. Who doesn't, right? I like explosions as much as the next girl. But the more that I dig into them, I become kind of frustrated with there's only one ethnic group per planet, one language, and I know why writers do it. It's much easier, and space is huge, and the idea of multiple planets, that scale is just mind-boggling. But I wanted the far future science fiction is very unrealistic, but I wanted to have a real feeling base that I was building it on, so that the reader could say, oh, this feels like a real world. So then hopefully they would trust me going forward when I said the completely off-the-wall stuff. Yeah.
Do we have any more questions?
The songs in your books are amazing, and do you also have melodies for them?
There are 2 real songs in the book that are real existing songs. One of them, the song near the end of the first book that Ananda and I uses to control Breck, is a real song. It's a medieval tune called Blomar May, and every medieval composer and their pet monkeys wrote masses based on that tune. So if you go and Google it, you will find a bunch of them. In fact, it's famous enough. You learn about it in school if you study music. So some number of modern composers have also worked with it. There's also a song. Oh, I'll wait for. There's also a song from. There's an American. They call it folk music, but I'm not sure it's really folk music. An American choral tradition called Shapenote, which is a method of notation that's supposed to make it easier for people to sight read who haven't had a lot of music education. And people get together on weekends. Almost every weekend there's a convention where people get together and sight read hymns out of a book. And so one of those sort of messed around and translated and taken out of rhyme is also in the book. So those are 2 real songs that are in the books. The rest of them, and they do have melodies, obviously. but they don't match the words because I acted like they were translated. The other songs, I don't have tunes for them. Although someone on someone on Tumblr made a tune for the egg song, and someone also made a tune for the It All Goes Around song. So if you search for those on Tumblr, you'll find those. They're out there. That's kind of super awesome. I loved when I saw that the people had done that. And I gather that the folks who, when Adjo Ando reads the audiobooks, she puts tunes on the words, but I don't know where she came up with those. Those will be her tunes. So.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Another big aspect of the book beyond the tunes is the tea ceremonies, the tea growing. Also, I was very surprised to see it such a huge part of the second book. And I know you're a tea fan, and how did you fit it all in? I mean, it is actual tea.
It is actual tea. It is actual tea. Yeah.
How did it become a plot point, and what is your favorite tea?
So, that would be like asking me to choose my favorite child or something. I don't know if I could, because there's so many different kinds. Tea is all one plant, but just from that one plant, you get so many different kinds of flavors. It's really amazing. I actually, initially I used the tea, partly because I just like tea, right? And my process of putting the first book together was like grabbing anything I thought was shiny and shoving it in there, you know. But also, I'm a huge fan of C.J. Cherry. I don't know if y'all have read C.J. Cherry. And in particular, she has at this point, very long-running series. The first book is called Foreigner. And I love those books. I just love them. And the Atevi, who are non-human aliens in those books, tea is very important to their society. And so I began using the tea partly because I liked it and partly as kind of a hat tip to C.J. Cherry. But what often happens when I write is I throw a bunch of stuff in because it's shiny, and then I have to deal with it going forward, and it ends up providing material for me to work with as I go. So once I put the tea in there, it just kind of led me to then use the tea more, which is how I ended up at the tea plantation. Yeah.
There's a lot of space emperors out there, but I think Ananda Mianai is unique among them. Are we allowed to ask something more about her background, her many-bodied, amazingly long past?
Yes, I've seen some interesting speculation about her past. I've seen people speculate that she was actually originally a ship. I should maybe not comment on that, because I'm a big believer in, I love the way that the readers really kind of dive in and think about things and kind of take them apart. And so I'm really reluctant to tell any given reader that the thing that they've constructed around it is wrong, because there's really no reason to tell them that it's wrong or right. So when people say, oh, Ananda was originally a human being who somebody made her eat vegetables too many times when she was little, so then she wanted to, rule things so nobody could make her eat vegetables. Or I'm like, I'm not going to say yes or no to that. Ananda was originally a ship or a station. I'm not going to say no to that. No. Whatever you, but yeah, she's going to have to be somebody with a really interesting past, because your average person doesn't just up and decide that they're going to multiply themselves and take over the galaxy, right? Yeah.
And then actually do it.
Yes.
We have a few more glimpses of Breck and also of Ananda, in a sense, in your short stories, and you've written other non-Raj related short stories, right? Mm-hmm. In case anyone has missed it, there are 2 amazing short stories online. You can maybe tell us a bit about them, and is there a collection upcoming?
There isn't currently a collection upcoming, although it would be nice in the future. The 2 stories set in the Raj universe online, one is at Strange Horizons, and it's called She Commands Me and I Obey, and it's actually novel backstory. Not everybody has noticed that because the names aren't the names that you expect, but that is actually, that was a story that I wrote while I was writing the novel, because I needed to understand where Breck had gotten all of her money. On a really technical kind of point when you're a writer and people say, oh, why did you do such and such? Almost always, the actual, no matter what the writer tells you, the actual answer is because it made the story work, right? And so Breck is very rich in ancillary justice because it makes the story work. But I needed to understand for myself how that had happened so that I could make the story work out right in my own head. So She Commands Me and I Obey was my answering that question for myself. The other story that's set in that universe that's published online, it's at Tor.com, and it's called Night Slow Poison, and it's set maybe 100 more years before the events of Ancillary Justice. So none of the characters are from the book are in the story, but it is definitely set in the same universe. There is sort of a tangential connection with the events in the book from where it's set. Most of my other short fiction has been fantasy. When I started writing short fiction, I did sell 1 or 2 science fiction pieces, but then discovered very quickly that editors were much more willing to buy my fantasy than my science fiction, so I didn't write a whole lot of short science fiction. And it's kind of surprising to me, it's kind of odd, because people who followed my short fiction career all thought of me as a fantasy author and were surprised when I came out with a science fiction book. People who have read my novels are surprised to discover that I've got all this fantasy. So it would be nice to write a fantasy novel sometime in the future, but that's not necessarily in the cards. But that's part of why there's no collection, because people expect science fiction from me, and so people who want a collection of science fiction, but I don't have a lot to give them. So I have to have people want my short fantasy. Yeah.
Oh, well, we'll give it some time. We have eternal problems shelving China Muville since he writes science fantasy punk.
Mm-hmm.
But people seem to love it anyway.
Yeah.
Do we have any further questions from people? Here.
How your story is very complex, as you said, and you spent a lot of time waiting to write it. But how you had like cultures and tea and ancillaries? But how did you manage that when you were writing in your work process? How did you write from the side, or did you keep it in your head?
Actually, most of the universe stuff I kept in my head for the first book. Then I got to the second book and discovered that was not going to continue to work. And so I actually downloaded TiddlyWiki. It's a little desktop wiki program, and started making entries. So I actually have a little private wiki where I keep track of universe details, because by the end of the first book it had become way too big for me to keep track of in my head. Yeah, but mostly because I tend to write, I don't outline very much, and so I would just go a step and then stop and think, and a step, and then stop and think. So I didn't have to keep the whole thing in my head. I just had to make sure my next step fit what I had done before. And so I didn't really have to keep that organized, but once I had to keep writing, then I had to, yeah.
And you had a question too?
Yeah. I was thinking about how much of a part of the novel's language is. How it all reads like it was written in another language and then translated as well as possible, which is why we come up against these things like in story you always have this how Rajai means citizen, so there is no word for someone who is not a citizen, and so on. Could you talk something about how you handled that? Do you have any foreign language or translator training? Or?
Very little. I took, like a lot of Americans, I took some Spanish in high school, and I took some German in college, and that was like all my foreign language training. But I have a sort of hobbyist interest in linguistic issues. The question of what kinds of things are easier or harder to say in different languages is a really interesting one to me. I think if you're a person who, which is true of a lot of folks in the United States at any rate, you never need to really think much about other languages. It's easy to assume that the way that you're thinking about the world and categorizing things is just natural. It's just the way things are. But if you spend a lot of time looking at the way another language categorizes things or says things, it can be really interesting and baffling and seem very strange, but that's something that has really intrigued me. And so I sort of follow, there's a blog, Language Log. I don't know if any of you guys read it. It's totally worth reading. It's a group blog, a number of linguistics professors who post on different things. So it's basically just a hobbyist interest, but it definitely is something I find really interesting, which is why it showed up in the text, yeah.
I don't think we caught the name of that blog.
Oh, Language Log.
Language Log, okay.
Mm-hmm.
And we had, yes, you had a question?
I was wondering, have you had any interest for like people wanting to adapt your work into other media, like such as film or television, and how would you feel about that, or do you feel about that? If that
there's actually a company has an option to make a television show. Now, option just means they can if they can manage to do it. It doesn't mean it'll actually happen. So that's really cool, and it's kind of free money for me. But I made sure when the offer came, I said I want to talk to somebody who's like involved with this, because there are two things that I was really worried about. I did not want a cast to be whitewashed, and I wanted someone who at least understood what I was trying to do with the pronouns, because both of those things are something that could go disastrously wrong, and that conversation went pretty well, but I can't, if it does happen, which would be super awesome, I don't know how they would handle the gender thing. I know when I said about the whitewashing, the person said to me, "Oh, that's not a problem. Diverse casts are really fashionable right now." It's a thing. And I was like, "Oh, all right." And so I really think the thing I was doing with the pronouns, it has a particular effect on the page because you can't see the characters, that we have such a tendency to try and pigeonhole everyone we see into one of two boxes, whether either of those boxes are going to be appropriate. It's almost an automatic thing for many of us. And as soon as you put actors on the screen, right, viewers are going to be pigeonholing people into one of two boxes, whether or not you mean them to. So I'm not sure how they would handle that. I just kind of have to trust, if it does happen, that they don't mess it up spectacularly and do something really horrible and offensive, because I will have no control over it at this point. But the production folks at least seemed to be trying to understand that that was an issue. So I'm kind of hopeful. In the best case, they would manage to do something that was not what I was trying to do, but something really different that only film could do, right? So that's kind of what I would hope for if it's happening. Yeah.
Have you ever heard anything from theater companies? I think that Justice of Torn and Breck as characters on a stage could work very well.
I haven't. You know, I have actually a secret fantasy that it would make a super awesome opera.
Yes. Space opera for
yeah. I think it would be, you know, my favorite operas are real heavy on the chorus, right? I love like Boris Godunov, you know, where the chorus is like a main character. And in fact, if this were an opera, the chorus would be a main character, and that would be super fantastic. Most modern operas are written with like very small casts and hardly any chorus, so I don't think that would actually happen. So I just kind of dream about it every now and then. Yeah. Well,
we'll have to. Leads into my other questions, but there are some amazing fan-made opera musical things in Russia where copyright is more of a thing that happens to other people.
Yeah.
For instance, Lord of the Ring musical, which is, you know, for being an amateur production, really cool. So keep your eyes open for YouTube.
Yeah, that would be fabulous. So officially, I'm supposed to frown on people like violating copyright and using the characters. Unofficially, I think it's awesome. So, you know, like fanfic or that kind of thing, I would totally be like, no, I didn't see that, that's fine.
And then you go.
Yeah, yeah.
How has your fandom interaction been? Like, how was this received in the classic science fiction fandom? There's been the whole, if everyone's aware with the Hugo Awards, had a kind of mess, but at the same time, there's been a more positive moment, I would also say, for more less whitewashed works. things that deal with the imperialist underpinnings of some classic science fiction tropes. Have you had any interesting discussions there?
There have been a lot of, I've been really pleased to see the ways that readers have engaged with the book. I've really enjoyed it. I really try to stay out of those discussions as much as possible because, as I said earlier, I feel like those are for the readers and not for me. But I don't want to get in there and kind of step on other people's fun, talking about it. But I really enjoy the heck out of the fact that it's happening. Yeah, and the Hugos were kind of a mess. But in some ways, of all the people who ended up dragged into that, I probably came out of it the best because the fact of the matter is that they can yell all they want, but it doesn't really affect me. And I'm very lucky that way. There are other writers involved who that's not the case. I'm extremely lucky to be able to just ignore them. Plus, they have actually sold some number of books for me. So, on that level, they can yip and yap and bark all they want. It only gives me publicity, But I kind of wish they would stop because it's much more fun for my friends when they're not being harassed. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Do we have more questions from you? Yeah.
Uh-huh.
I just have a question about animals.
Okay.
Because I don't remember other than fish sauce and I don't know. Is there any animals in it?
There are not a whole lot, and that's actually kind of a gaping hole in my world building, I have to admit. Well, there are chickens. There are chickens. Who lay eggs?
Thousands of them.
Yeah, thousands of them. Peep, peep. And but I would think to myself, well, I'm sure, obviously there are farm animals. Obviously, even if you can grow cheap sort of prefab food, there's going to be a luxury market for meat. And obviously people will have pets. But then when I would sit down and say, oh, so-and-so has a pet cat, it just felt wrong.
Why?
It felt a little too everyday, right? And so people's pets never made it into the book. And I feel that as a lack in my world building, but I feel like it has to be there. There are people on the station keeping lizards and mice, and, there definitely are pets, yeah. Probably bugs, probably pet spiders, yeah.
It would be nice if another me and I had a cat that also got made over and over.
Somebody said that just the other day. Said to me, Ananda and I should have a white cat, and cloned, right? And every Ananda and I petting the white cat at the same time, right? Yeah.
I read on Tumblr someone had named all their cats in Neko Atsume, the cat collecting cell phone game, to Ananda Meownai. Easy way to keep track of them.
Yes.
I think Anna is here.
Yeah.
You want to say your question, or should I read it?
Oh, I can say. I understand that many of the best authors are also very good readers. And I wanted to ask you what type of reader you are and what you prefer to read.
But I grew up reading science fiction and fantasy, mostly science fiction when I was younger especially. But I'll read just about anything. But now lately, this is kind of ironic, I got into this business because I love to read, right? As soon as I became successful at it, I suddenly had no time to read. And so I spend a lot of my reading time lately reading nonfiction because I'm researching for the next book always. And I'm way behind. I have people sending me, emailing me saying, oh, this novel's coming out next year. Can you blurb it? And I've got a stack of them now, and I'm like, I don't know if I'm ever going to get to it. And I really want to be able to. So I'm actually way, way behind on my reading. I used to be up with award season would come around and I'd be like, oh, I've read all those, right? And now I'm like, I haven't even heard of that. So it's put me way behind on my reading. Yeah.
And Anders, you also had a
Uh-huh.
Yes, it's probably better if you read it, otherwise it will become twice as long and
Yeah.
not very understandable.
Well, in recent years, a lot of research has been done on the way human memory works and how unreliable it can be. Was this something that you considered or inspired by when crafting the character of Ananda Mianai?
That's a really interesting topic. I didn't spend as much time with human memory as maybe I should have. I spent a lot more time on theories about consciousness, which of course is closely entwined with ideas about memory. I think a lot of folks think of identity as being a function of memory, of remembering certain things, but there are more complicated things going into that. And to some extent, I short-circuited that because, for instance, it would not have been convenient to my story to say maybe Breck's memory is unreliable, for instance, which realistically, let's be realistic, probably Breck's memory would be unreliable, right? Because all of ours are. Over that time, we re-edit our memories and we think they feel very real and very true, but 9 times out of 10 they're not, right? But no, that's something that I probably didn't look into as much as I should have. Yeah.
Is there anything?
Din kund där nere som undrar om hon kommer tillbaka.
Skicka upp henne så tar vi det sen. We have a late coming.
Oh, okay.
And Undershed, another question. Readers of sci-fi and fantasy have been conditioned to expect a certain progression in book series and to value certain conflicts over others. Have you gotten a lot of pushback from readers who felt you moved the story in the wrong direction?
I've gotten some. I've definitely gotten some pushback. I got a fair amount of pushback over the second book, where I spent a lot of time on very local issues and very personal issues. For myself, I mean, every reader is entitled to their own reaction, so I do not ever want to say that any reader's reaction is wrong. Your reaction is your reaction and valid. But for myself, I really needed that very personal and local focus to move on to the next part, and I've gotten pushback over the third book from the folks who have been disappointed that there was not a big space battle that totally then took Ananda and I completely out of power. And I totally understand where that's coming from because, I mean, I was a big Star Wars fan. I was 11 when Star Wars came out, and I saw it like who knows how many times in the theater, kept going back in, take my money, you know. But realistically, it sounds goofy for me to say realistically for the story like Ancillary Justice, but realistically, one person is not going to be able to take down a system like that, let alone have it all be a happy ending, everything's wonderful. If Breck were somehow magically able to completely take out Ananda and I, it would be chaos over all kinds of star systems. Billions of people would die. There would be war everywhere. That would not be a happy ending, right? Leaving her in power is not a happy ending either. And I felt very strongly for myself that the only possible hopeful ending was to say, here, she has a space. Here, she has this small victory. And the ultimate result, in my opinion, the ultimate result of that victory is going to be the end of the Rach, right? It can't continue to survive after what's happened. But I totally do understand the folks who feel very let down that they didn't get their big space battle with every Ananda and I dying. Yeah.
If they make a TV series, maybe they'll add a big space battle.
You know, that seems strongly likely, actually.
We had a question about the exactly, and the Gek. Will they turn up in the coming book? And
the Gek turn up in the next book, actually, yes.
And can you give us some more details also about when the book's coming?
I'm about a quarter of the way through the first draft of the next book, which I plan for it to be a standalone. It's in the same universe, obviously, or the Gek wouldn't be there, right? And it's due by the end of this year, so assuming I actually turn it in on time, then it should come out sometime next year. So, but it takes place after the events of the trilogy. It is not in Rach space, so it's outside of Rach space, so it won't have the same characters, but...
Then I think we won't ask more about the Gek right now. We'll just wait and see.
Yeah.
And this is from a Vincent. Do you wanna? Or
No, I had another question.
Is Vincent here?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you wanna ask the question?
I think I asked.
You already asked it?
Okay.
I think. Maybe
More or less. Then let's see.
Yeah, I just wonder, I mean, given the first book, I mean, with the time jumps, is very different stylistically than the other two. And I'm just wondering, given that now you've, I mean, been given the opportunity to expand as an author, how have you changed as an author? And are there different tricks that you're thinking that, but soon I will be able to employ these, or rather that some things you feel like, okay, but, well, different tricks as an author?
That's an interesting question. To some extent, I've never really been conscious of doing that, but obviously I can look back and see that I have. The time jumps and the point of view stuff was a pretty big learning curve for me. So to some extent, I'm kind of relaxing that I don't have to do that sort of omniscient, because that sort of carries through for the whole trilogy, right, with the soldiers on the ship. And I'm just sort of having to feel through what my next cool thing that I want to do is. But I'm not sure that I've seen far enough ahead to see where I am. I always have to kind of look back and see where I got to.
And looking back, which character and what scenes were like the most fun or the most vexing? Anything?
Oh, you know, a lot of the characters were fun. I loved the heck out of writing the translators. They were so fun. They were so fun to write. In fact, when I wrote the second book, and I brought translator Leckie on stage, and I was like, "Oh, she's so fun! This is fabulous!" And I realized I knew she was going to die, but I didn't realize she was going to die so quickly. And I got to the point, and I was like, "Oh, this isn't right. I have to keep her in the book longer." And I was like, "I can't." There was no way I could do it that wasn't going to mess up the book. And I said, all right, I'm going to make it up to myself in the third book. And almost immediately, I see it on Twitter sometimes. Somebody will tweet something like, "Oh my gosh, I'm reading Ancillary Sword, and I just came up to translator Leckie. She's obviously the best character in this book. Why isn't everybody talking about her? She's fabulous." And I'm like, I'm just going to wait an hour. And yeah, there's shoe drops. And I've had people, you know, on Tumblr or email me and say, "Why did you do this? I loved her so much, and I hated that you did this." And I'm like, yeah, just wait for the third book. And so, but also I did that, I mean, to make it up to myself. I was like, I am going to bring translator Zayat on as much as I can, because I really feel like I cheated myself with translator Leckie. So both of them were a lot of fun. I loved writing Sfeen. Sfeen was a lot of fun to write. A very different kind of character, very deadpan in a way that translator Zayat never is overtly. She actually, there are places where translator Zayat is kind of being snarky, but it's hard to see because she's translator Zayat. So Sfeen was an awful lot of fun. I loved writing Breck, or I would not have stuck with her for 3 books. That's a huge amount of writing with one character. The characters or scenes that were vexing, actually, you've all read the first book, right? Because this is like massive spoiler city here. The scene where Lieutenant An gets shot was so very difficult to write. Not just because the first couple drafts I was like weeping while I was writing it, but also because I knew that was the most crucial point of the first book, because what happens to Lieutenant An is the reason why Breck does every single thing she does through the whole book. And because of the way I structured it, the reader has had to trust me up until that point that what Breck's doing makes sense. And when that point comes, that has to convince the reader. The reader has to go, "Oh, now I understand." And I knew if I flubbed that, the reader was going to go, "Oh, this is stupid," and very rightly set the book down, right? And so I tore my hair out over that scene. It was just really stressful and difficult. And so for the most part, it seems to have worked, but I was very glad to put that behind me, yeah.
Well, I cried too when I read it every time. Do we have any further questions? Yeah.
do you have any near misses? I mean, decisions that you were almost took about the story that you are very happy that you didn't.
Oh,
choose?
there are bunches of them, but I'm not sure I can think of them now, because I don't outline, and so very often I'll take a step forward and realize that I've gone the wrong way, and sometimes it'll be several steps forward and realize all of that has to be pulled back. But much of that I've forgotten by now. But there are plenty of them. Yes, yeah. And I can't pull up any,
Absolutely.
off the top of my head. Yeah.
Yes, you have a question there?
Yeah, one of the things I really like about what you do with Breck is that in this first-person narrator, you have a deeply unreliable first-person narrator who has complicated and very large emotional reactions which are mostly invisible. It's one of my favorite things about Breck as a character. And I'm curious as to whether it was difficult for you to figure out how to get that negative space to register to the reader.
Yeah, that was something I worked really hard on. It's a technique I've seen other writers use and imitated them using it, but of course I'm using it on a huge scale with Breck. But it took some, like I would write a scene and then go back and say, oh no, that sentence can't be in the narrative because it's a little too blatant, or wait, I have to add something in. But it was just like constant fine-tuning to get that. That was really kind of tough, but it was also actually a lot of fun, because at least for me as a reader, very often I find that that kind of portrayal of emotion has a more visceral effect on me than the kind of, and I wept and my heart was broken, and that can work for me. I don't want to put down that style of depicting emotion, but the just sort of the implication hits me harder. My theory is it's more like real life, right? Because when we're talking to each other, I don't go, oh, and I was sad, right? You're talking to another person and you're having to constantly guess what they're feeling by little cues. And so it feels more true to life when you're doing that with reading. That some readers actually have reacted very badly to that. I've seen a number of comments with the protagonist is completely emotionless, or which is like, she's the opposite of emotionless, whatever the complete other end of the scale. Or the protagonist just does things for no reason. Just for no reason at all. She even says she doesn't understand why, and I'm like, that's denial. Do you think she doesn't know why she pulls? She knows why she pulls Varden out of the snow. She knows why. It just pisses her off, right? Yeah. So, yeah.
I think Ben Aronovich mentioned something similar. He writes urban fantasy, Rivers of London, and his character thinks about things a lot and doesn't react very visibly to them. Which readers have also said, has he no feelings?
Yeah.
And you're like, no.
Well, I feel like that technique is less common in adventure-y kind of fantasy and science fiction, and more common in like the more literary end of, like, if you were going to read a short story in a high-end some realistic story, they would be more likely to handle emotion that way. And oftentimes we think of, well, I'm a good reader, but all of us, our reading habits are kind of formed by the things that we've read before, and we learn how to read things by reading lots of that kind of thing. And so if you haven't read a lot of one sort of thing, you come across this other thing and you're like, oh, I'm not getting it. And it's not because there's something wrong with you, it's just your reading history doesn't match up with that particular thing, if that makes sense. Yeah. And I think there are some readers who their reading history doesn't match up with that particular technique.
Well, we're rounding this off. Do we have any final question from anyone? Then I would say thank you for coming here, and we hope to see you again soon in Sweden.
Thank you for having me. This has been fabulous. Yeah.
Thank you.